You have probably already encountered this pattern today, not in the Bible, in ordinary English. Consider a familiar sentence. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Read it again slowly. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. The first half and the second half are mirrors of each other. Prepare appears on both sides. Fail appears on both sides. But the order is reversed. That reversal is not an accident. The sentence was constructed deliberately because a mirrored sentence lands differently than a straight one. The symmetry makes you feel the point before your mind has fully worked out why. The relationship between the two ideas becomes easier to notice, easier to remember, and harder to ignore. This literary device has a name, and once you know it, you will start finding it in places you have read dozens of times without ever noticing it was there. The device is called a chiasm. The word comes from the Greek letter chi, written as the letter X. The name was given to this pattern because of the way it reverses, moving forward through a sequence of ideas, reaching a turning point, and then mirroring back. A simple version of the pattern looks like this. A statement is made, call it A. A second idea follows, call it B. A third idea appears, call it C. Then the sequence reverses. C appears again, in a different form, C'. Then B, mirrored, B'. Then A, returned to, A'. A, B, C, C', B', A'. At the center of that structure, between C and C', is the pivot point. That is where the two sides of the pattern meet, and in many carefully constructed chiasms, the writer places unusual emphasis there. Not always, scholars debate individual cases, but often enough that finding the center becomes a meaningful interpretive question. This is not a secret code hidden underneath the Bible. It is a structure hiding in plain sight, and once you learn to recognize it, the text begins to look like something different than you thought it was. Start with one verse. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Jesus is speaking about the Sabbath, and he says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." Look at the reversal. Sabbath, man. Man, Sabbath. The two elements swap positions in the second half of the sentence. You can see the basic reversal that makes this kind of pattern recognizable. The structure creates emphasis through symmetry. The point lands with unusual force because of how it is constructed, not just what it says. This is the simplest possible version of the pattern. One sentence, a single reversal. Ancient writers, Hebrew poets, wisdom teachers, the authors of the Gospels use this kind of deliberate symmetry at the level of the individual verse. But some of them also used it at a much larger scale. What happens when the pattern isn't just a sentence? What happens when it spans an entire story? Open Genesis, chapter 6 through 9, the flood narrative. Most people read this story the way they read any story, beginning to end, following the sequence of events. The water rises, the ark floats, the rain stops, Noah emerges, a rainbow appears. But scholars who study the literary architecture of Genesis have identified something in this narrative that is easy to miss when you are only reading forward. The structure of the flood story appears to be chiastic. The opening and the closing mirror each other. The movement toward the flood and the movement away from it are arranged in parallel layers. It looks something like this. A. Noah and his sons enter the ark. B. The flood is announced. C. The waters rise. God remembered Noah. C'. The waters recede. B'. The flood ends. A'. Noah and his sons leave the ark. Follow the parallels. Entering and leaving the ark. The waters rising and the waters receding. The announcement and the conclusion. Each layer on one side corresponds to a layer on the other. And at the center of the entire structure, not at the beginning, not at the end, but at the pivot, is a single sentence. God remembered Noah. In English, remembered can sound like God had simply not been thinking about Noah for a while. But in Hebrew narrative, the word zakar carries a different weight. When God remembers someone in the Hebrew Bible, it consistently marks the moment when he acts on an existing commitment. It is not a memory lapse being corrected, it is a covenant being honored. The flood story's center is not the height of the water, it is not the destruction of the world, it is God's faithfulness to one man he had not abandoned. The literary architecture of the passage places that truth at the pivot. The two sides of the story, chaos entering, chaos departing, are organized around a single theological claim: God does not forget. When you read the flood story only forward, you experience it as a sequence of dramatic events. When you read it with the structure in view, you see what the writer placed at the center. That is a different reading, and it came from the same text.
And if you enjoy finding patterns like this in Scripture, stay with me, because the next example takes this idea from one passage to something much larger. Some scholars who study the Gospel of John have proposed that it is organized around a large-scale literary architecture, that the Gospel itself moves through carefully arranged sections that build toward a center and then mirror back toward the ending. This is a proposed reading of John, not a settled consensus. Scholars will arrange the structure of John's Gospel differently, and the debate about its large-scale architecture is ongoing. The point here is not to pretend that debate does not exist. The point is what the debate itself reveals. John's Gospel is full of deliberate parallels, carefully positioned scenes, and repeated theological motifs. The signs that open the public ministry correspond to events at its close. The prologue and the epilogue echo each other in ways that feel intentional. The question the Gospel keeps pressing, who is Jesus, appears not just in individual conversations, but in the way the entire text is architecturally arranged around that central claim. Once you start looking for literary architecture in John, you stop seeing 21 chapters as simply a chain of events. You start seeing a text that was built, carefully, intentionally, by a writer who knew exactly what he was constructing and where he wanted your attention to land. And what is striking is not that John used the exact same structural template as Genesis. It is that this kind of deliberate literary symmetry appears repeatedly across very different biblical texts, different authors, different genres, different centuries, different languages. That kind of recurring pattern across that kind of distance raises a question the text itself does not answer for you. Why does it keep appearing? And now, the thing that changes how you read. We almost always read the Bible forward, first sentence to last, beginning to end. We follow the sequence because that is how we have been taught to read, and because most of what we encounter in life is designed to be read that way. But once you recognize a chiasm, you can read it differently, not only from beginning to end, but toward the center. Think of it this way. You are not reading a straight road from one end to the other. You are reading two paths that begin at opposite ends and move toward each other. Where they meet, that is where the writer placed the pivot. The A at the beginning corresponds to the A prime at the end. The B corresponds to the B prime. The C corresponds to the C prime, and they all converge on the center. This does not mean every proposed chiasm in the Bible is convincing. Scholars identify chiastic structures with varying degrees of confidence, and some proposed structures are more persuasive than others. Reading toward the center is an interpretive technique, one that can open up a passage when the structure is genuinely there, and one that should be held loosely when the structure is proposed rather than established.
But in the flood narrative, when the structure is there, reading toward the center gives you something you would miss if you only read forward. The catastrophe and the survival are both organized around a single pivot. God remembered Noah. That is not decoration. That is the point the writer wanted you to find. So what do you do with this? You do not need to become a scholar of ancient literary architecture. You need one habit.
When you are reading a biblical passage that feels deliberately constructed, when words or ideas seem to repeat in a way that feels intentional, slow down. Ask whether the passage has a center. Not every passage does. Not every proposed structure is convincing. But when a center is genuinely there, it is worth finding. Ask, what did the writer place at the pivot? What is the point where the two sides of the passage meet? Because once you start asking that question, it changes what you look for every time you open the text. Go back to the sentence you started with. By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. You recognize the reversal immediately before you knew what it was called. The structure was already doing its work on you before you could name it. The symmetry made the relationship between the two ideas impossible to miss. The flood story was constructed with the same kind of deliberate symmetry across multiple chapters in a text written thousands of years ago in a language most of its readers have never spoken. The parallels were placed there intentionally. The center was chosen carefully. When the structure is really there, it was there every time you read it. You just were not looking for it yet. If this opens something in Scripture you have not seen before, share it with someone who studies the Bible and has never encountered this. Subscribe to Bible Truth Finally Clear. There is so much more hiding in plain sight. God bless you.